And then they developed fencing systems that worked with the new material or the new equipment.
Yes. Okay, so there are many manuals and manuscripts also in French. What about English ones? Do we have manuals in English?
Oh, we do. We absolutely do. Okay. The earliest treatise in English is a translation. Okay, let me be strictly accurate. There are a couple of manuscripts which, in my opinion, do not constitute a sufficient amount of data to create a system from.
Yes.
Okay. For example, the Liddell manuscript, as is known. And it's kind of flirtatious and frustrating hints as to how it was done.
Yes.
In the 15th century, but that's all we've got. Then we have a translation of de Grassi's Swordsmanship Manual, originally published in, I think, 1570 in Italian, and it was translated into English in, I think, 1590. And then in 1595, Vincenzio Saviolo published what's called His Practice, which is a fencing manual, and it is the earliest fencing manual I know of that is a complete fencing manual and was originally published in English. Wow. And then George Silver answered that in 1599 with his very famous Paradoxes of Defense. And then from there we have some rapier treatises from the early 16th century, for example, Pallas Armata and treatise from Joseph Swetnam. And then from then on, there are either English translations of French, usually French manuals, or further fencing manuals just written in English directly. I should say, on the subject of George Silver, I have to mention, right, George Silver is this crusty old English bastard, right, who absolutely hates Italian fencing with the rapier, and he decries it as dangerous and foolish, and he spits venom on the page in the most extraordinary way. But he also describes in some detail the English martial arts that the Italian rapier is supplanting, right? And in his opinion, that is greatly to the detriment of English gentlemen everywhere, right? So he wrote this book, Paradoxes of Defense, and it is it's a crucially important book in its own right, because it gives us this window into earlier martial arts as they were practiced in England. And he describes the weapons. And one of the things he says is, you know, in a rapier fencing school, you don't learn how to grapple. Whereas in proper English fencing, you know how to grapple. I'm paraphrasing wildly, but you get the idea. Okay, so I'm actually, right now, I am producing an audio book of this Paradoxes of Defense in two forms. I've got it in modern pronunciation. I have an actor who's reading the book in modern pronunciation. And I've also hired a chap called Ben Crystal, who is an expert on how English was pronounced in the 16th century, particularly in Shakespearean plays.
Yes, yes.
And sort of 1599 is like peak Shakespeare. So he is doing an audiobook of George Silver's Paradoxes of Defense in original pronunciation.
Oh, that's magnificent.
Isn't that cool?
It is.
It's like I had this idea and I was like, oh my God, that's brilliant. And so, yeah, that was like a couple of months ago. And now it's actually happening. They're recording it as we speak. This is like the 29th of April now. And they are recording it right now. I don't know when this is going out, but yes,
it's fascinating, because English, as we know, has gone through major changes. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Magnificent. And another question I have, do we have any, excuse me, Scottish sources, like a Scottish swordsmanship basket?
Oh, okay. Here's the thing. There are Scottish sources, as in sources written by Scottish people, dating back to the late 17th century. I'm not sure which one is the earliest, but Sir William Hope produced his Complete Fencing Master or the Scots Fencing Master. It's the same book with different titles. It was produced in several editions, sometime around the 1680s. And you know, that's French fencing. It's small sword. And it has some quirks, but it's clearly French. But Donald MacBain wrote his Expert Swordman's Companion in 1728, or it's published in 1728. And it is, again, it's basically French small sword. And he even describes, he has this fantastic section in his book, which is an autobiography of his extraordinary life. I mean, we're talking, okay, he served in the army in various different ways. Like one time he was supposed to take a bunch of conscripts onto a conscript ship, and they were all going to get shipped to Europe. And so the captain of the ship got him drunk, so he fell asleep. And he didn't wake up until they were out at sea, because the captain of the ship knew he'd get paid extra for an actual sergeant. Right? Right. And you know, it's totally disreputable. I mean, he was, for example, he was running prostitutes in the camps, in the military camps of the late 17th century, and making a fortune doing it. And then officers would come and try and steal his girls away, and so he'd duel these officers and stab them multiple times. And yeah, it's an absolutely incredible story. So yes, but the fencing in it isn't particularly Scottish. It's right, should we say, a Scottish flavour of a French art.
Okay.
There are some sort of indications of how the Scottish claymore was used, as in the broadsword.
Yes.
Claymore can mean two things. It basically means big sword in Gaelic. So the claymore in the 18th century is a closed hilt weapon with a wide blade. This sort of thing, but this is an Italian version of the same idea. And of course, it can also mean the big Scottish two-handed sword from earlier. Yeah. We don't have, to my mind, any. Well, I've not yet come across what I think of as a complete, or at least a sufficient and authoritative source for any of the truly indigenously Scottish ways of fighting. They're described, McBain describes his first battle at Killiecrankie, and it's hysterical. He's like, he'd run away from his job as an apprentice cigar roller, right? Yes. And there he was in his first battle, and he was like, I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I was back in Inverness rolling cigars. I don't want to be here. This isn't very nice. And sure enough, his side lost the battle, and he ran away. And he tells this fantastic story of running away. And there's this Highland, because he was on the government army, and it was these Highlanders who broke the government army. And there's this. He's a redcoat, and this Highlander is trying to kill him. And there's a horse between them. He was trying to get onto the horse to run away, and this chap came up too soon, and they're kind of keeping the horse between him and him and the Highlander. And eventually, he kind of runs away, and there's this 18-foot gorge with a river running underneath it with rocks everywhere. And he realized he had no choice. He either had to jump it or he was going to get killed. And so he jumped the gorge. He lost a shoe in the process. He left his gun and his hat, and he jumped the gorge, losing a shoe in the process, but managed to escape the pursuit. And to this day, that spot near Killiecrankie is called Soldier's Leap.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. McBain is fantastic, and I'm also planning on producing an audiobook of his autobiography. I just need to raise the money and hire the right actor and get it done, because it is just too good a story to be left in a book.
Absolutely, that's fascinating. Okay, just two more questions regarding the manuscripts and manuals. Do we have Portuguese sources?
Yes.
As well, okay.
I'm no expert in any of them. If I recall correctly, there are some early 17th century Portuguese sources on the two-handed sword used basically as like a bodyguard's weapon.
Wow.
Right, and they have these. We were talking about forms when I interviewed you for my podcast.
Absolutely.
Right? They have these forms, like, okay, if you are on a galley and there are people in front of you and behind you who are boarding the galley, this is what you do. So you kill them. I'm just making up stuff with my fingers, but you get the idea, without killing the rowers.
Yes.
So special sword forms for on a galley, and they have similar ones for if you're in an alleyway that is this big but not too big, and your principal is down, and If you have a wall behind you, do this. If you don't have a wall behind you, do that. And it's all forms.
Fascinating.
It's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, there's also a chap called Godino, Godinho, if I recall correctly, who has similar forms, but for two swords at the same time.
Wow.
Right?
Like two side swords, guy? Two side sword?
Yeah, two of, hang on. This sort of thing.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah, and the great thing about them is they actually specify the context in which they're supposed to be used. So this form is for this situation.
Yeah.
This form is for that situation.
Yeah.
Right? And it's clear that in most cases, the person swinging the sword around is the bodyguard.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's basically for professionals.
Yes.
Right. This is not for how you deal with your friends or how you settle an affair of honor. This is, you're a professional bodyguard and shit has gone down. This is what you do. Right. It is so cool. But again, life is short and languages are hard. And so I haven't actually dealt with those directly myself, but I have colleagues who have gone really deeply into those systems. So I get that secondhand from my colleagues.
Let's move on. First of all, let's move on to Northern Europe, the Nordic countries. Do we have sources from Nordic countries? Finland, Sweden?
Yes. Okay. The one I'm thinking of at the moment, I think it's Didrik Porath. There's like a fencing dynasty in Sweden. The surname is Porath, Porath. And one of the Poraths was fencing master to Helsinki University in, I think, the 17th century or the early 18th. Might have been a touch later. There are some sources there which are fascinating in that, okay, my Swedish isn't good enough to know this for sure, but from what I gather and looking at the images and what have you, it's, okay, in 1603, Salvatore Fabris was fencing master to the King of Denmark. Okay, and Denmark and Sweden, and I mean, Norway was part of Sweden until about 1916 or 17, something like that. So politically they were one thing, and then Finland was part of Sweden until 18. I should bloody know this because I lived there for a long time. Should we say 1820-ish, something like that? And Finland was then handed over to Russia, and they became independent in 1917. That I'm sure of. So there was an awful lot of kind of cross-cultural stuff going on between Denmark and Sweden, and Finland was part of Sweden at the time. So it's, we can think of those as kind of like one larger culture. And Fabris was fencing master to the King of Denmark in 1603, if I recall my dates correctly. And a century later, more than a century later, we're seeing Swedish language fencing treatises, which are basically a rehash of Fabris's fencing treatise from 1606. So clearly, either they're copying Fabris's published book, which is quite likely, it was published in Copenhagen, or they are, I'll tell you what, one second. This is too good not to do. Just
sure.
give me a second. Okay. We're talking about Fabris.
Yes.
This is a copy from 1606.
Wow.
Yes, you see? And it has, let me show it to the camera.
Yeah.
Okay, so published in Copenhagen.
Magnificent.
1606. And this is Christian IV, who was king of,
yes.
Christian IV, who was king of Denmark at the time, who was, if you like, Fabris' student. And I mean,
amazing.
So, but then he has this very distinctive, very strange way of holding guard positions.
Yes.
And we see that in the in the Swedish treatises from much later.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. This is sort of the pride of my collection.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's a lovely, lovely book. Yeah, so what I don't see any Finnish or Swedish sources that are in any sense, shall we say, original, as in not a representation of some pre-existing system. Right? I've not seen a source for, shall we say, authentically Finnish sword fighting or authentically Swedish sword fighting. Now, if anyone watching this has done, feel free to send me links and stuff, because I would love to see that, but I've not come across it yet.
And they're written in Swedish or in Finnish, or they're written in Latin?
The Porath manuscripts, I have one of them, or two of them, and they're written in Swedish.
Swedish, oh wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Fascinating. Okay, let's move on for the last thing as far as manuscripts are concerned. What about Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, even Russia?
There are loads of sources.
Oh, they are, okay.
Again, because I don't read the languages,
right,
and an awful lot of the discussion around those sources is in those languages, then I'm aware of the existence of various sources from that part of the world, but I've not actually dealt with any of them directly.
Okay, interesting. Okay, let's come back to your school and start talking about weapon systems you teach. Could you just tell us which weapons you teach now?
Okay, it's probably best if I go chronologically.
Yes.
So the earliest system that I teach is from the middle of the 14th century. It's a sword and buckler system based on a manuscript that is currently in the Royal Armouries Museum, and it's called, the manuscript is known as 133 because that's the Liberi reference number for the manuscript, and it's anonymous, and it is a very thorough and complete system for fencing with a sword and buckler. Okay, a buckler, just, oh, where's my buckler? That's a buckler, in case any of your watchers aren't familiar with them. So then 15th century, I'm doing Fiore's Art of Arms. That's the thing I'm probably best known for. It's the thing I've written the most books on. Then Vadi's very similar, related source from the 1480s. And then I kind of skip over the 16th century a bit, because there are a lot of sources from there, but when I started to get into them, one of my students wanted to do original research into that period, and so I just sort of let him have it, and haven't quite gotten around to getting back to it. But I'm familiar with them, but I don't teach them because I haven't done like in-depth study of the sources. So then early 17th century, we've got various rapier systems, and Rodolfo Capoferro wrote a book called Il Gran Simulacro dell'arte de uso della scherma, which is the great representation of the art and use of fencing. And that's, again, a book I've sort of dived deep into. And so when I'm doing rapier, I'm mostly doing Capoferro. And then the rest of the 17th century, I tend to leave alone, not for any particular reason, just because there's only so many weapons and so much time. And so then middle of the 18th century, there are various small sword systems that I have studied. The one that I know best is by a chap called Domenico Angelo, who was Italian, trained in France, taught in London. He founded a dynasty of fencing masters that extended until sometime in the late 19th century. And he's a classic French small sword. He wrote his treatise in 1763, and it was such the definitive work that when Diderot was compiling his encyclopedia, he used the entirety of Angelo's School of Arms, L'École d'Armes, as the entry for fencing. Right? He reproduced it in its entirety. I've got a reproduction of the reproduction here. So yeah, I mean, you can't get better than that, right?
Oh.
And I tend to lose interest in the 19th century because it becomes basically the sword as a sidearm was falling into disuse, and I am most interested in sidearms. Okay. I mean, I do also do like spear and poleaxe and various other things, but I'm like with shooting, I prefer pistols to rifles. I can use both, and the rifle is in many situations obviously a much better weapon, but the one that calls to me is the sidearm.
Yeah.